A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom. All praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Yahushai, Ba'ashem, Kakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone of teaching us his truth and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwath that may listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Raquai, and back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, it's just going to be in regards to a little bit of exhortation in regards to making peace with your fathers. This is a topic, that hits a little bit close to home. Just discussing some of the things and mistakes I've made. And Lord's will is always, this will be an edifying lesson, right? A lot of us, including myself, when you look at the way a lot of our people grew up, a lot of us don't always grow up with that healthy relationship with a father, whether he wasn't around for whatever reason. And sometimes, you might grow up very overly emotional, being surrounded by, an emotional mother all the time. And it creates a very unhealthy relationship and an unhealthy image of how you see your father, right? So through the spirit and power of Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushai is to properly mold into having proper understanding, right? And essentially, if the shoe fits, wear it, right? If you have your father in your life, and he's around, make the attempts to actually make peace with him. It's good conduct. It's good. It's essentially just good conduct, right? We work to strive to put off that old man, because you look at the way our people behave towards their fathers, especially in the world. They have a very strong distaste for their dads, right? So let me actually start with that in Colossians. Let me get it in KJV here. So this is Colossians 3. And I'll start at verse 9. It says, Lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man and his deeds, and have put on the new man, that is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. So we'll work on to put off, the old ways, the old habits, and one of these ways is just essentially, it's a way that is not brought forth and it's not conducive to life, because, a lot of us carry and have that anger, towards, our fathers, and we don't essentially know how to process and essentially properly resolve conflict, whatever reason it may have been with our fathers. And sometimes a lot of the rift can be caused, or was caused, because you could probably, as a son or a daughter, if you're listening to this, you probably were strongly influenced by some rhetoric by the mother, because she was in her emotions, and hearing those things were piercing, and it changed the way you saw your father, right? So it gave you a very unbalanced understanding of how you see your father. So you now, that misunderstanding coupled with anger, malice, and probably rage, it's essentially, it creates this distaste for the way we see our fathers today, right? So we're looking to put off those old ways and actually try to make peace with our fathers, right? This is good time, to use grace period to be able to mend a lot of those ways. Because when you look at our nation as a whole, doesn't have we're very well known for not having very good relationships with our fathers, right? So being renewed with this understanding, it's a very good opportunity to be able to mend and fix a lot of these old habits, right? Especially if you're listening and you have your fathers in your life, this is a good opportunity to do so, right? So let me jump to the book of Sirach. Let's bear with me on this. Okay, this is Sirach chapter 3, verse 12. And it says, "My son, help thy father in his age, and grieve him not as long as he liveth." Right? You have an opportunity to actually help him. He's alive. Help him out. Is as straightforward as that, because that is an opportunity to be able to, maybe there were some things that he did that rubbed you the wrong way, and there's just a way to essentially voice those things in a very, very respectful manner. You don't want to voice them in a very essentially in a way you might scold a child, right? Remember, at the end of the day, he's still your father, right? There's just a way to handle these particular situations, right? But saying that, that being said, if you have the opportunity to actually make peace with him, take it upon that opportunity to actually do so. If you have your parents in your life like that, right? I'm kind of more speaking on leaning towards fathers specifically, because as a nation as a whole, like I said earlier, we don't have the best relationships with our fathers, right? This is verse 13, and it says, "If his understanding fail, have patience with him, and despise him not when thou art full of strength." And that was one of the biggest mistakes for myself I've made, because sometimes as young men, because we are full of strength, vigor in life, it's a little bit tough for us to essentially have and understand some of the things our fathers are probably going through, because remember, they're up in age, right? So they don't have the I don't want to say they don't have the mental faculties, but it's not as strong as you are in your younger age, right? Remember those things. So you have to be able to essentially exemplify and practice patience, right? So it requires a certain level of suffering, right? And this is all suffering in a righteous sense. You're not suffering in a wicked sense, like you see the majority of our people. Is a right way and a wrong way to suffer, and I'll talk about that in a sec, right? So here it says in verse 14, "For the relieving, excuse me, of thy father shall not be forgotten, and instead of sins it shall be added to build thee up in the day of thine," in the day of thine affliction. This is verse 15. "In the day of thine affliction it shall be remembered. Thy sins shall melt away as the ice in the fair warm weather," right? So this is another reason to exemplify and capitalize on this opportunity to make peace with the Father. For example, for myself, I'll just use myself as an example. One of the things I normally do is that I like to send him some supplements, because I know he's the type of person, he takes very, very good care of his health. He's a person, he likes to walk, he likes to read, so I send him some stuff to help for his brain, so to make sure his cognitive functions are working properly. So those are the types of things I would do with the little that I have, right? The scriptures say that if you're giving, you give according to the little that you have, making peace with them, right? But it didn't always was that way for myself, speaking specifically. It had to go through a bit of ups and downs, and then for myself, there was a lot of situations where, you know, there was a brother that told me this years ago, and he said once a parent, twice a child, because when they get to a certain age, they all they you have to be a little bit patient with them. Sometimes they might forget things, sometimes they might lash out at you and get angry. That's all part of the little bit of suffering. If you have that opportunity to make peace with your father, then by all means do so, right? This is good conduct. We've lost this as a culture. This makes us, coming back to our nationality, being properly cultured, right? Look at the way the rest of our people behave and compare and contrast. You start to see the difference, because the way that they behave, they would rather fight their parents. They would rather, when I say curse out their parents, they use profanity, and they very, very out of order and disrespectful, right? You see the way a lot of our people behave, right? And that is strongly perpetuated by this black culture that is not essentially conducive to life. So I'm going to read verse 15 again, and it says, "In the day of thine affliction, it shall be remembered. Thy sins also melt away. I'm sorry, also shall melt away as the ice in the fair warm weather," right? So looking at the amount of sins we have, we have lots, right? This is why we're in this condition as a whole, because we screwed up and we sinned against the Lord, right? But I'm saying this is also an opportunity to essentially exemplify your fruits of the Spirit toward your Father, right? If He's around, right? Take that opportunity, as we have this grace period. So now I mentioned a point about suffering, because in making peace with your Father, you might have to suffer, right? And that's part of it. You suffering is a part of the walk, right? So let's go to this is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 19, and it says, "For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience towards the Most High endure grief, suffering wrongfully. For what glory is it, if when ye be buffeted for your faults, ye shall take it patiently? But if when ye do well and suffer for it, ye take it patiently, this is acceptable with the Most High, Yahweh Bashem Shai." Let me get that in the NLT. I want to see how that reads. Just bear with me. Let me look for it. Okay, so here in the NLT it says, "For if the Most High is pleased with you when you do know what is right and patiently endure unfair treatment," right? So there were moments, from my speaking for myself, had opportunities to make peace with him, right? And it essentially it didn't feel good. I'm just gonna leave it like that. But the point is that over time it got to a point where essentially, I was able to have more of a healthy dialogue with my Father, right? It still can be very uncomfortable. I want to be honest with y'all, at times. So, because, they're at an age, especially when they're up in age, it's very uncomfortable because they're not they're not applying a spiritual mindset to a lot of the things that they go through. And they're kind of more about, man, they can be very, very cranky sometimes too, right? So that requires a certain level of understanding that you have to take it patiently, right? This is verse 20, and it says, of course you get no credit for being patient when you are beaten for doing wrong, but if you suffer for doing good and endure it patiently, the Most High, Yahweh Bashem Shai, is pleased with you. So there were moments when, like, man, I remember one time, like, I remember being at the beach, and my father, hey, man, he said, let's go get something to eat. And I said, man, I kind of just want to, I want to shower first before I go in before I go to the restaurant. And he started to get kind of like fussy and angry, but I kind of dismissed it, and I was just like, you know what, I stood my ground and I said, I'll meet you there. If you want to start without me, start without me. But the point is, it would be incorrect, it would be bad behavior if I had tried to scold him and get into like a shouting match, right? And this requires a certain level of spiritual understanding, also emotional intelligence, because you don't want to get into a heated back and forth, with your father, right? You don't want to get into that. You want to be able to deal and have conflict and deal with conflict resolutions, and resolve them in a healthy way, right? In that situation, scriptures say a soft answer turns away wrath, right? But grievous words can stir up strife. So, it's just about a being properly cultured, b having these different works. Yahushua talked about a tree is known by its fruits. These different fruits, works, the Greek word there is karpos, meaning works or deeds, remembered, taking the opportunity to do so. And in C, it helps you to exemplify Yahushua. It helps you to exemplify these fruits of the Spirit, right? In what facet, because not every, and like I said, if the shoe fits, wear it, because not every brother is very close to family like this. But this is an exhortation for brothers. Okay, you may not live with them if you live with them, or they're distant, but they're still pleased to dwell with you. That's the point, to make known here. This is good exhortation, this is good practice, this is good, because remember, we're not trying to keep all the laws 100% in this society, but through these different works or conduct, this is proper upbringing, right? Because you don't want to be suffering as an evildoer, right? There's a right way and a wrong way to suffer. So because I spoke about patience earlier. This is Galatians chapter 5 verse 22, and it says, but the Holy Spirit in the NLT produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against these things. These are all fruits of the Spirit, right? And let me tell you, it requires a certain level of patience to be able to endure those things. But those things are, healthy fruits to essentially exemplify, right? So that's pretty much it. If you have the opportunity to do so, take the opportunity, seize that opportunity, right? Because as the scriptures say, the end of all things is at hand, right? So these things, we want the Lord to These things, sometimes I believe that these things happen, in our lives, to be able to exemplify certain fruits of the Spirit. And the more fruits of this and the more treasures you have stored up, the Lord can easily remember us in times of trouble. Think of it as practice, and think of it as also long-term investment, right? Because scriptures also say that riches profit not in a day of wrath. As a matter of fact, I'll end off with that one. What's that? Proverbs. It's lucky. My thing's kind of slow. This is Proverbs 11:4, and it says, "Riches profit not in a day of wrath, but righteousness delivereth from death," right? So this is exemplifying an attitude of righteousness, right? And we want the Lord to remember us in those times of wrath, spirits created for vengeance, like it says in Ezekiel, I'm sorry, not Ezekiel, Jeremiah. I've numbered some to the sword, famine, to roughly paraphrase, right? All these different things come into pass, right? These things, we want the Lord to remember us in these times because of these things. Just like how the angel, when you go into the book of Tobit, the Lord, coupled with the angel Raphael, healed Tobit because the things that he did, burying the dead, those works that he did were remembered, right? Those works that he did were also, there was a record of those things. So we want our Lord to remember a good record in those times of trouble, if that catch my drift, right? So Lord's will, as always, is edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.